SFBBO, promoting sustainability by engaging communities for more than 40 years. Our Birdie Hour speaker series is a free virtual program. On February 25th, 2025, SFBBO Science Director Maddy Schwarz gave a Birdie Hour talk about Western Snowy Plovers in a changing world for our community.
And I'm so excited to be here. I love working with plovers. I love working with birds, obviously, and I've lived in the Bay Area my entire life. And so it's especially important to me to be able to help a threatened species that lives in the Bay, that lives in this very unique habitat that is kind of only present here, which I will go into in more detail in my presentation. But yeah, without further ado, I will just go ahead and get started. So let's just hop into it. So this is an overview of everything that I'm going to be talking about. We're going to split it up into a bunch of different parts. Part one, we're just going to go over snowy plovers generally, their biology, how to identify them in the field, about their life history, all that kind of stuff. Then part two, we're going to look at where specifically they exist within the San Francisco Bay, and also what sort of threats are acting on them within the San Francisco Bay. Then we're going to take that kind of like big scale, we're going to take that big scale macro view and we're going to zoom in to just what happened last year during the 2024 breeding season. And then we're going to zoom back out and say, okay, now that we have this information, like now that we have last season as an example, how does last season fit into the greater management context and how we're all trying to mitigate the threats that that plovers are facing in the Bay. And then finally, we have a quick little section of how you can get involved with the Snowy Plover and Lease Turn program here at SFBBO. So yeah, let's just jump in. So here we go. Part one, Western Snowy Plover. This is what the chicks look like. They are beyond adorable. They're the cutest things you've ever seen in your entire lives. And they're tiny, as you can see by, I think this is my predecessor, Ben Pearl's hand, going to pick one up. They are microscopic. And I put my question in the chat asking how many people had seen plovers before. And it seemed like a lot of people hadn't seen them, which don't feel bad at all if you haven't seen them. They're very hard to see because they're only around 6 inches tall. They're only around 6 inches tall. They're about the size and shape of a soda can, actually, if you want to think about it in those terms. And they are ground nesting shorebirds that occur along the coast, and they're about the same weight as 8 quarters. So you can tell that they're very small. So if you haven't seen one, don't feel bad. But maybe after this presentation, you'll feel a little more equipped to get your binos and go out and try to find some. These are what the adults look like during the breeding season. The males have dark patches on their shoulders and also a dark band across their forehead, whereas the females are a lot more drab. And then in the winter, the males lose those dark markings, and so you can't sex them anymore in the winter. They just are all a lot more plain. And we have another species of plover in the Bay, that is only here in the winter, which is the semi-palmated plover. Those are a lot darker in general. The snowy plovers kind of have this like grayish brown color, whereas the semi-palmated plovers are kind of more of a chocolatey brown color, and they also just have much more severe dark markings. So that's kind of how you can tell the difference apart between the two species. This is what the chicks look like. They are precocial, which means that as soon as they hatch, they're ready to go. That's part of the species survival strategy. Since their nests are just on the ground, they're very vulnerable to predators. And so they don't want to be tied to that location where they're sitting ducks, essentially, sitting plovers. And so the chicks, within a couple hours of hatching, are ready to get up and start running and moving and foraging for themselves. And so you can see on the far left, that's what a chick looks like when it's just hatched, when it's wet from being in the egg still. The next photo is when they're dry. That is all they need. That's all the time they need to be able to leave the nest. They just need to be able to be dry. As soon as they're dry, they can leave and they can start doing their own thing. Then the third picture is a chick that's around 2 weeks old. So it looks a lot more like a bird, but you can tell it's still scruffy. Not all of its feathers are grown in yet. And then the fourth picture is a juvenile. That's what they look like once they are fully capable of flight. And they fledge in around 28 to 33 days, which just depends on how many nutrients they have available to them. If they're eating well, they'll fledge earlier. If they're eating not as well, then it'll take them a little bit longer. So this is their species. This is a species range. So we used to consider the West Coast population to be its own separate subspecies, but now it's been grouped in with the rest of the snowy plovers that occur throughout the US, but they're just behaviorally distinct from the West Coast population. So they're still behaviorally distinct. They still have their protected status. But technically, like within the genetic classification, everything in North America is now Anarhynchus novosus novosus, and every plover that exists in South America, every snowy plover that exists in South America is Anarhynchus novosus occidentalis. But the West Coast population is still behaviorally distinct from the interior population, which means that are the species or the birds that are occurring along the West Coast have a different kind of migration pattern and breeding pattern than the birds that are in the interior. The birds in the interior, they breed in the interior and then they go to the coasts for the winter. Whereas the birds that are only along the coast, they stay along the coast for the entire year. They don't migrate. They stay along the coast. Some of them will stay in the exact same place where they were hatched. They'll stay in that same place all year. Some of them will go up and down along the coast a little bit, but some birds will actually go further north in the winter, and some birds will go further south. So every bird that was hatched along the coast is just kind of moving up and down along the coast, whereas every bird that's hatched in the interior of the United States disperses to the coasts during the winter. I hope that makes sense. And this is the kind of thing that over time, if this behavior continues, then eventually it would become a subspecies because they would be completely genetically isolated from the interior species. But I think they've decided that hasn't been happening for long enough. And so they're still part of the same subspecies, but they are behaviorally distinct. So this is a zoom in on the range of the Western Snowy Plover, which is the Pacific Coast population. And you can see that, like I said, year round, they're occurring basically throughout the entire range. There's only a tiny bit up in Washington that they're only there during the breeding season. And then like in Baja, they'll only be there during the winter. And throughout much of their range, they occur on beaches. They're beach nesting birds. They like dunes, they like river bars, and they like naturally occurring salt pan. By and large, they'll be on like sandy beaches. Whereas in the San Francisco Bay, we have unnaturally occurring salt pan because we have salt pan that is a result of all of these historic salt ponds that were created in the Bay Area in the like late 1800s, early 1900s, which I'll talk a lot more about in a little bit. But yeah, so most of the plovers in the bay occur on salt ponds and levees and dredge material, man-made habitats. You can see that the interior population comes out to the coast during the winter, whereas the West Coast population just stays along the coast and goes up and down it. And so if you were to go out and go birding right now, you would see interior birds here for the winter. You wouldn't be able to tell them apart from the West Coast birds, but there are interior birds here right now. And so this is a census showing the annual census that we do of winter plover numbers that we've been doing since 2004. So Fish and Wildlife coordinates two week-long censuses in the year, one that occurs in January and one that occurs in May. So it's a winter count and a breeding season count. This shows our winter counts for the last 20 years. And as you can see, the trend is going up. So that's good. That's really great to see. In 2024, we had the highest count of birds that we ever have seen during the winter count. This year in 2025, I haven't updated the slide, but this year in 2023, it was back down around average, kind of more in the like 350-ish range, which is to be expected, but overall that trend line is still going up. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the non-breeding season, since that's the part of the year that we're in right now. The birds will often, during the winter, they'll often come back to the same locations over and over again. They kind of have spots that certain flocks will like to hang out at, and they'll rest and forage, build up their fat reserves for the coming breeding season. And yeah, I just want to point out that breeding or wintering habitat is very important. Often in conservation, there is such a focus on breeding habitat, but winter habitat is sometimes where the birds are actually spending more of their time. There's been studies that another snowy plover researcher has done up in Sonoma that showed that the birds are actually spending up to 60% of the year at their wintering sites. And so the winter sites are very important. We don't want to forget about them. But now, as will be happening in just like a week, we're going to transition into the breeding season. So the breeding season for plovers is very long. It lasts from March 1st to September 15th, but usually it goes until September 30th. And throughout the breeding season, they will be laying nests on the ground, and their only defense against predators is to have good camouflage and blend in with their surroundings. So you can see those two birds in the picture on the right. They are basically the same color as the sand behind them, and that is their strategy, is to be as small and inconspicuous as possible. And their nests are also small and inconspicuous. So this is what their nests look like close up. It's usually between 1 and 3 eggs in a clutch. 3 eggs is by far the most common. A 1-egg clutch is really rare. We get like a handful of 2-egg clutches every year, but 3 eggs is the vast majority. And they also have cryptic coloration to blend in with the ground. And the nest is incubated for around 30 days. And something that's cool about plovers is that the adults actually share incubation duties. So during the day, the female incubates, as you can see on this photo from a camera trap that we put out. And then at night, the male comes and incubates. So you can see how much browner the female is. Like even though this night picture is black and white, you can tell how much darker the male is on the shoulder there. So then at dawn and dusk, they'll switch, and the male will go eat, rest, while the female sits during the day. And then at the end of the day, the male will come back and the female will rest for the night. But once the nest hatches, then it's the male that takes care of the chicks. So the females will actually leave and go find another male to start another nest with, while the male stays behind and rears the chicks. And so the chicks are precocial. They can run and forage for themselves, but the male, his most important job is to keep them warm, because since they don't have all of their feathers yet, they get cold really easily. So they will do something called brooding, which is where the chicks will kind of shove themselves up into the male's like chest area and just huddle there and be warm. And so when you're surveying, you'll see these weird little like balls of feathers and legs that are the male brooding the chicks. And then when the chicks are warm enough, they'll pop back out and start running around and foraging again on their own. And young chicks will freeze if they're threatened, whereas older chicks are more likely to run. So this is showing the San Francisco Bay breeding population. There's a lot more information going on this slide, which you don't have to worry about so much, but you can see that like the winter the winter trend, this trend is also going up, which is also great to see. However, if you notice at the top of the chart, there is that dotted line of 500. That's the RU3 goal. So that is the goal, the Bay Area. For the species to be considered for delisting, we need to get to 500 birds. So you can see that we're well below that still, but we're going in the right direction. So this is some more information about the historical South Bay. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the history of the South Bay, but it's pretty interesting. So prior to colonization and industrialization by Europeans when they came into the area, the Bay Area was basically completely all tidal marsh and mudflat. You can see in that legend on the left, that kind of like browny green color is tidal marsh, and you can see that that's the vast majority of the Bay Area is tidal marsh. And that means that there was not that much plover habitat historically. If you look at that kind of peachy salmon color, the salt pan or salt pond, only kind of in Hayward on the east side in the East Bay, that's the only place where naturally occurring salt pan was prior to colonization. So if you're thinking about being a plover and you're thinking about how the only, like your biggest asset is that you're brown and you can blend in with sand, then if you're looking at this lovely lush green and blue marsh habitat, then that's probably not going to be your best bet. But now, if we jump forward to the year 2000, this is what the bay looked like in the year 2000. So you can see that a lot of that tidal marsh has just been absolutely decimated. There's not very much tidal marsh left at all. And that peachy salmon color, that's the salt pond, has completely taken over the South Bay. It's by far now the most dominant habitat in the South Bay, which means that there is a lot more plover habitat in the Bay Area available. This is a map that's out of date at this point because the Salt Pond Project, which I will talk a lot more about in a bit, the Salt Pond Project has already breached a lot of these ponds and opened these ponds back up to tidal action. Like I said, this is a map from the year 2000. If you were to look at a map now in 2024, there would be more tidal marsh that has been restored because of the Salt Pond Project. But there's still a lot more salt pan than there was before any Western influence on the bay. So, all right, now we're going to talk about where the snowy plover sites within the bay are. So you can see this map on the right is where we had confirmed breeding this year for 2024. Every pond that's outlined in black had a nest on it this year. And in anti-clockwise order, we have Ravenswood in Menlo Park, we have Alviso in Sunnyvale, we have Warm Springs in Fremont, Dumbarton in Newark, Coyote Hills in Fremont, Eden Landing in Hayward, and Hayward Shoreline in Hayward. These are the 7 complexes that we divide plovers into. And you can see that, and roughly half of those complexes occur on Salt Pond Project land. All right, now we're going to talk about threats. So the most important threat to snowy plovers in the Bay Area is predators. We have a lot of predators, both natural and human influenced. Red foxes and common ravens are both species that were not that common prior to like 2000. Like the 90s, it was rare to see a raven in Santa Clara County, and now there are hundreds of ravens. And if any of you have ever encountered ravens, you know that they are very smart and they are very good at finding things, and they are very insatiable. They will go after anything. And so ravens are by far the biggest threat to plovers in the bay right now, but also red foxes are another invasive species that have spread across from the East Coast to the West Coast. They're also no good. They can take out a lot of, like one fox can take out like an entire pond's worth of nests in one night. We have recorded that happening. So foxes are also not good. And then peregrines, even though those are a native species that we like, they can also be very hard on the adult plovers because peregrines prefer to eat birds. So another threat is human disturbance. And we don't have so much of the photos on the left. We don't have to deal with that as much as people in the rest of the range that their plovers are on beaches. But we, even in the bay, we still have public access. We still have people recreating on trails, and we also have people trespassing and going off trails and going around fences on the ponds that are not public access. And we also have people with off-leash dogs and drones flying over, even though drones are forbidden on refuge property and I think also CDFW property. We still see drones. And finally, habitat loss is another really big issue, and this can come from several directions. It can come from invasive plants. We have a lot of problems with that in the bay. Ice plant and mustard are really big issues that are so hard to stop once they've started. And then also, this is more of a problem along the coast, but it will be a problem for us as well. Sea level rise and beachside development are also not good because you get the water coming up from the shore and you get the development coming down from the uplands, and then that beachy area just gets squeezed smaller and smaller to have less and less habitat. As you can see in that photo, there's barely any beach. So now we're going to talk about the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project, which I promised that I would get to. This is a project that on the leftmost picture, they're breaching a levee with an excavator, letting the water flow back in. And those next two pictures show the progression of how the marsh vegetation comes onto the plain, onto the marsh plain, and grows back really quickly. The dates are way too small, but there's basically only a year difference between those two photos. One was taken in April, I guess it's a year and a half. One was taken in April 2008 and one was taken in September 2009. So you can see that very quickly that dry, crusty, salty area that the plovers like back into this lush green tidal marsh habitat. We love tidal marsh restoration because there's all, like, tidal marsh is so important. There's other endangered species that rely on tidal marsh. It's also great for flood protection. It's great for protection against sea level rise. It's great for public access. The Salt Pond Project is also adding a lot of trails, like the Bay Trail, like a lot of Bay Trail connections and things like that. And also just on like a human level, I mean, the scars of colonization go so deep in this country, and like nothing is more apparent than having this like beautiful natural ecosystem be turned into just like these straight man-made like direct evidence of capitalism acting on the land. Like if we want to be good stewards of the land, it's imperative that we restore as much as we can and heal the scars of colonization as much as we can. But because life is very complicated and because 200 years have happened and life will always find a way, things have gotten very complicated in the intervening years. And now those same salt ponds are also providing very important habitat for other endangered species like snowy plovers, like California least terns, and then also important wintering habitat for non-listed species, but migratory waterfowl, ducks, dowitchers, godwits, stilts, avocets. All of these species really rely on the salt ponds in the winter when they're flooded for foraging and food. So yay, we love tidal marsh habitat, but oh my God, oh no, what are we gonna do about the species that are being negatively affected by restoration? So now, with that sort of baseline set, we're gonna talk about the 2024 season. And this picture is the 2024 Plover crew. Shouts out to all of these people. They work tirelessly throughout the season, and none of this work would be possible without them. From left to right, we have Josh Scullin, Jesse Wentworth, myself, Laura Tavez, Parker Kay, and Jeremy Reinhard. This was your 2024 Plover crew. All of the data that you're about to see is thanks to the tireless efforts from these people. So this is my flow chart of what happened during the plover season in 2024. So total nests on 396. That is an astronomical number of nests. If that is every single nest that we had monitored, that would have been the most nests we had ever monitored ever. But 68 of those nests were found as inactive because plover nests are very hard to find. And sometimes you don't find them until they're chicks. And you see a brood of chicks running around that you're like, oh, I thought there shouldn't be chicks here based on how many nests we know are on the pond, and yet there are chicks here. So that means that we missed a nest that hatched while we couldn't find it. So 68 were found as inactive, which means that the total number of nests we monitored was 328, which is still a lot. It's actually the second highest number of nests that we have ever monitored, behind only 2017. Then, but just because there are a lot of nests doesn't necessarily mean that the birds had a good year, right? Because if they're just consistently restarting nests over and over and over again, but not getting anywhere and not hatching, then that just means that they're wasting their energy. So how many nests failed? 138, or 42%. And why did those nests fail? Like I said before, the biggest threat to plovers in the bay is predators. So 132 nests were depredated, or 40%. And then only 6 more failed for other reasons. So some of them, the eggs were just not viable and they didn't hatch. One was abandoned and one was flooded. So that means that 177 nests hatched, or 54% hatched. So how does that stack up with previous years? Well, 53% is our average hatch rate for the last 10 years. So that means that if we had a lot of nests and an average hatch rate, then that's still a really good year. So 2024 was a great year for plovers. And then we also had 13 nests that we could not determine the fate. It was unknown fate. There were too many things going on. We couldn't figure it out. But yeah, good year for plovers in 2024. And this shows where the birds were found. This is the same map from before. You can see that Eden Landing by far has the most nests. That is very typical. That's typically what we see. And then Ravenswood and Alviso, that's also very typical for those to be the next biggest areas. And then this is just looking at the same data in a little bit of a different way. So this is at the complex level where we're looking at like those big areas. This is breaking it down at the pond level. These are individual sites. So these top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. These top 10 ponds were responsible for 80% of all of the nests in the South Bay. And everything else, every other pond, which is 19 other ponds, all had less than 10 nests each, and those are 20%. So 80% of nesting happens on 10 ponds, which is kind of crazy to think about. And now we're going to look at the most productive ponds by hatch rate. So here, E14 had the highest number, 16%. That's the highest number of nests, followed by A13, R3, R1, A22. If we look at it by hatch rate, then by far the pond with the highest number of nests and the best hatch rate was A13. You can see that E14 was a little bit, even though it had the highest number of nests, it had a lower hatch rate. So A13 wins the Best Pond of the Year award for 2024. Highest number of nests with the highest hatch rate. All right, now we're zooming back out. We're gonna use what we learned during the 2024 season. We're gonna zoom back out to how we were able to have such a good season when there are so many threats going on in the bay. So this is myself and Dave Halsing, who is the manager of the Salt Pond Project, with a bunch of oyster shells. that we picked up from a plant nursery, I guess is where they were being stored, a plant nursery in San Francisco. And the reason why we were picking up oyster shells is because SFBBO did a study starting in 2009. It was a study that ran from 2009 to 2013. And it showed that plovers will preferentially nest on ponds that have been enhanced with oyster shells, that have been enhanced by having oyster shells spread over them. And this, we believe that this is because the oyster shells increase the camouflage that the plovers have on the pond, which I will demonstrate with my handy oyster shell enhancement visualizer. So if we see here on this slide, we have in the background, we have a picture of E14 where we spread the majority of the oyster shells. You can see that it just looks like a lot of whitish brown lumps across the entire pond as far as the eye can see. And then in the foreground, we have this beautiful glamour shot of a female snowy plover sitting on a nest, doing her job, keeping her eggs safe and warm and happy next to some oyster shells. And now we're going to shrink this photo down until I couldn't get it to shrink any further, but until it's a little bit more at the scale of the entire shell plot. And so you can see that as that bird gets smaller and smaller, it gets harder and harder to see. And so the ravens and all the other predators and us, when we're surveying, have a much harder time finding the birds when they are within this shell plot. And the birds know this. They like nesting in texture, and they also like nesting next to objects. That's also something that has been shown. And so they will preferentially nest in shell plots. So this is a map of the oyster shells that were spread at E14. Those yellow squares on the left are the pilot shell plots that were active from 2009 to 2013 when we did this study that proved that they will preferentially nest in the shell plots. And then after that was a success, then we expanded the shell plots into the green areas. And then it's even been expanded further since this map was created. And so the majority of E14 has been covered in oyster shells. And you can see here that the number of nests increased dramatically after we spread the shells. So the shells were, the big shell plots were spread at the end of the 2014 season. And so you can see that starting in 2015, that number jumped up and stayed really high for at least the next 5 years. And now it's kind of dropped down a little bit, but it's still higher than it was. Like you can see 2006 to 2011 when there were no oyster shells on the pond, still way above those numbers. And also in this graph, you can see that the hatch rate is kind of still around that middle area, that 40 to 50% range. And that is consistent with the hatch rate across all sites. So if you are attracting plovers to an area, and they're nesting more in that area, even if the hatch rate is still the same as it is across the board, you're still increasing you're still increasing the number of nests in that area, and thus increasing the number of nests that have a chance of hatching. So we want to spread more oyster shells across the bay, and that's something that we've been working on for the last 5, 6, 7 years. We've been spreading shells in more places. We've spread shells on SF2 in Ravenswood. We've spread shells on other ponds in Eden Landing. There's been shells spread at a small site in Mountain View, and there's opportunities to spread shells in other places. And the goal is to attract the plovers to these areas that are not going to be breached and open to tidal action, so that they have somewhere to go when other ponds are breached in the future. We also are hoping to increase predator control. This is another tactic that is useful for plover management. You can see here that these are a bunch of photos of ravens eating eggs. Like I said before, ravens are the biggest predators that plovers have in the bay. And something that is an interesting comparison to look at the efficacy of predator management is using alviso as a comparison. So the ponds in the yellow box on the right are the alviso ponds, A15, A13, and A12. And these ponds are becoming more and more important for plovers in the South Bay because they're getting drier and drier. And so in 2023, we had I don't have the number of nests, but we had a fair number of nests. Nothing as crazy as this year, but we had a fair number of nests. But USDA, which is the organization that does predator control on refuge lands, USDA only removed 7 ravens from this area in 2023, and the hatch rate was only 42%. Whereas in 2024, USDA removed 109 ravens and from like the same area, and our hatch rate jumped up to 75%. So predator control can be a very useful tactic. And then finally, this is my last slide about how you can get involved, or my last section about how you can get involved in plover work. So the first thing is you can volunteer at habitat enhancement events that we do at least annually. We try to do them biannually. And there's going to be another one happening on March 8th at Eden Landing, but this one is a very special one. It's actually going to be, we're asking for volunteers to help us set up MODIS equipment, which I did not have time to get into MODIS in this presentation, but this is a project that we're starting this coming year that we're really excited about. That is essentially a radio transmitter tagging project where we're going to be tagging up to 20 adult plovers with radio transmitters, and they're going to transmit data, location data to a nearby radio tower. But in order to get really fine scale data, we are going to be setting up these like a grid of nodes that are basically like miniature receivers that are then gonna transmit their data to the tower. So anyways, I don't need to get into all the details, but if you would like to help carry radio equipment and rebar and conduit and walk with us on the ponds and put that into the grid formation, March 8th, we are requiring that you have rubber boots because we will have to walk through standing water. There's no way to get around that. So if you don't have rubber boots, I'm very sorry. This is not the time for you. But if you have rubber boots, come out. Should be an interesting time. And then also be part of the solution, not the problem. Yay. If this is your first time hearing about plovers, or you learned something new today that you didn't know before, tell someone about it. Let them know. Be like, hey, did you know that there's these tiny, adorable birds that live in the Bay Area that you maybe have never seen, but they're out there and they need our help to keep being out there. Also, be responsible dog owners. If you have a dog, pay attention to where dogs are allowed and where dogs aren't allowed. Keep your dog on a leash whenever you're hiking. That's just like good practice in general. And be a responsible hiker. Don't go off trail. Even if it looks really cool over there, I promise there's a reason. There's a reason that it's been blocked off, and it's not because we hate you or we hate public access. It's because there's birds that are trying to do their thing, and they have just as much of a right to this space as we do. And then finally, stay connected. You can, if you're interested in volunteering on terns, which is another species that I work with that I did not talk about in this presentation, but if you're interested in doing surveys for terns, that program is going to be starting up towards the end of March. So you can feel free to reach out to me about that. And like Kristen mentioned, we have a lot of other great resources and stuff on our website. And then I finally just wanted to end with this slide that is a reminder that things are going in the right direction, but they will only continue going in the right direction if we keep up the fight, if we keep doing all of these intensive management things, if we keep having money for monitoring. And I hope that this presentation has inspired you to be a plover lover like myself and everyone else here at SFBBO. And thank you. I will take questions.
Thank you, Maddy. That was a really great presentation. And we do have some questions in the chat. Do you have any recite data on plovers brought to the International Bird Rescue?
Yes.
Thank you, Kelly,
Yes,
for
we do. So International Bird Rescue, for those who don't know, is a great organization in Fairfield that does rehabilitation for injured and sick wildlife. And we have periodically transferred snowy plovers, eggs and chicks, and sometimes adults that we know would otherwise die without human intervention. We have taken them to IBR. And this year, crazily enough, we actually did not have any reason to take any birds to IBR, which is kind of weird. That kind of never happens, but we didn't, like, SFBBO did not give any plovers to IBR this year. Some other organizations farther up in the North Bay, they gave IBR a bunch of birds, but we did not. But we did have birds in 2023 that were brought as chicks and eggs and successfully reared at IBR and released back in the bay. And we have recited, I believe, all 5 of those birds multiple times since they were released in August of 2023.
Excellent. Thanks, Maddy. And thanks for the question. We love IBR, and it's an example of how small organizations bond together and collaborate to create solutions for birds in our area. And it's one of our favorite things is our partners. The next question is from Elaine. The question is, how often do the oyster shells need to be replenished? Is this done every year? Do some sites retain them, even broken down a bit, that you don't have to do this so often?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. It's something we're trying to figure out. So the shells do persist for like a very long time on the pond bottom. Some of the pilot shell plots that were spread in 2009 are still like evident because we didn't just spread pilot plots on E14. We also spread them on a couple other ponds, and they haven't been touched up, and you can still see them and the birds are still using them. So they do persist for a very long time. However, it does seem like there is some amount of degradation that happens. And whether that's just because the shells are slowly getting buried by like sediment that's accruing, or whether it's because they're losing like some sort of shine or like quality that the birds are picking up on, we're not sure. But it does seem that there's some sort of degradation. And so we're looking at like over the years on E14, we've like touched up shell plot areas. We've like respread shells in areas that seem to be getting sparse. And yeah, so we've done a little bit of touch-ups, but for the most part, they last for a long time. And they don't need like I said, they like them more when they're newer, but they still use them when they're older. Like if you look at our nest data from E6B, like every single nest we had at E6B last year was just in one shell plot. One of those pilot plots from 2009, which is crazy to see, just how much they prefer it and how much it still is functional after like 15 years at this point.
Good question, and thank you for the answer. The next question is from Laura, and her question is, what happens to ravens that are removed?
Yeah, so this is a sensitive subject, but they are lethally removed. We are not the ones who do that. USDA is the only organization that has the appropriate permits and the appropriate like expertise to do it humanely. So they are the ones that take out predators. And that's a very long-standing program that has a lot of stuff feeding into it. It's not just for plovers, it's also for every other endangered species that's in the area. But yes, it is lethal removal.
Okay, thank you for your answer. Ronald has a question. Do making islands in the middle of salt ponds help protect the birds from terrestrial predators?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. And it seems like yes, if you can convince the birds to use them. Um, there have been multiple constructed islands that have in multiple ponds. There's constructed islands at A16 in Alviso, at SF2 in Ravenswood, and at E12 and E13 and Eden Landing. And for the most part, plovers do not use the constructed islands unless they are covered in oyster shells. So E12 and E13, those islands have oyster shells on them, and we do get plovers nesting on them every year. Not a ton, but some. Whereas the islands that were constructed in A16 and SF2 that are covered in gravel or just have like pickleweed on them, they don't use those. Those islands have all been taken by other water birds, which is great to see. Most of those islands have really large like Caspian or Forster's tern colonies on them, or avocets or stilts, or I guess those are oyster catchers. Those are the big ones: Caspian terns, Forster, stilts, or California gulls, which isn't great, but they're there too. But yeah, the plovers will only use the islands that have the oyster shells on them. And I think at this point, since the islands at A16 and SF2 have been like claimed by other species, we wouldn't like put shells on those to try to make them plover islands. The plovers are we're happy that the plovers go to the islands in E12 and E13. And we keep them there.
That's a really interesting question. Thanks for that. And it looks like we are now at the end of our hour. But thank you again, everyone, for coming, and thank you, Maddy, for a great talk.
SFBBO is a nonprofit. With your support, we will continue to inform decision makers, inspire people to act, and involve diverse communities in our work. Please visit our website to learn more and get involved today.